דאר צריכה להגיע, חיים אמר תשובה, אבל מה שטוב תמיד אני אומרת, צריך לא להגיד, היא בחיל האוויר.
לנו קצת אקטואליה. צריך לתקוף או לא לתקוף? מה אומרות התיאוריות?
אז כאילו...
לא דווקא זה לא זמן להגיד.
אבל אנחנו גם...
אולי לנתח בצורה קלוקלת מה קרה בדיעבד.
יכולת להסביר אולי.
אני בלחץ, אז זה טוב
להסביר לכן כפוסט מורטם.
להסביר לנו משהו קרה. במקרה הטוב.
ממש. הייתי, אנחנו גילינו את זה שהיינו בחלט, היינו חדשות כל הלילה, כאילו היינו בשוק. מה הולך להיות? מה הולך להיות?
זה קבלה לדבר איזו תקופה כזאת.
ממש.
אבל זה תמיד ככה.
לדבר את הנושאים האלה. לא, עכשיו זה... כן, עכשיו זה אקסטרובה.
עכשיו זה פה, אבל תמיד היה את המלחמה באוקראינה.
הייתה אמורה לטוס.
כן, עכשיו זה פה, זה ממש, מה שהיה ביום שבת זה ממש, כאילו...
הסביבים האלה של אגרסיה.
עשה נעימה, פאלה, כל הסיסמאות.
חוץ כל מה שקורה במדינה, הם היום...
לגמרי, כן.
ליומיים.
הכישלון שלנו, את הנגביות, תודה רבה, אפשר לפרק את זה כנושאים שלי לאן להרתיע.
ואני אגיד לך, סביר, כן, אני נעליתי על הטיסה, היה בלגן מלא חבר'ה שבגבו להם טיסה, אני תסתכל עליו, אנחנו חלק אלינו, אבל לא שנייה חצרת. חברה שלי בתאילנד, ביטלו להם את הטיסה לראות את יום שבת, אמרו להם יש לכם טיסה עד ביומן, שהם ילד בן 8 חודשים.
Okay, so let's start this class today. I understand that there were some confusing messages on email, but anyhow, this is the class. Of course, it will be recorded and uploaded to the Moodle for those who cannot attend the class or didn't know about the class today. Actually, this is quite an important class because we start constructivism, and we'll do it on the opposite order comparing to the other theories that we discussed in this in the class, because we first look into a specific theory, securitization or the Copenhagen school, and then we'll move to some more general notions about constructivism. So I'll demonstrate constructivism through the theory of securitization. So we first start with securitization theory. I'll provide some background on the emergence of this scholarship. It is important to emphasize that this is a constructivist theory that focuses on the discourse of security or the discourse of insecurity, and basically it examines the way in which certain issues are constructed as existential threats, and in this way legitimizing taking extraordinary measures to address the challenge, whether it is exist or not. And so after I'll develop the theory and we'll understand the theory and its elements, we'll move, of course, to the securitization of cyber threats based on, of course, the article of Lina Hansen and Nissenbaum. And one of the empirical and in general very interesting cases that we have in cybersecurity is the struggle between Russia and Estonia in 2007. This is one of the key cyber attacks, and it is very interesting story here because the attempt was to
לחוק כזה לא היה יום זכות.
No, maybe there are more classes in which groups of 5 students are waiting. Okay. So
It was supposed to be the 110.
So the case of Estonia is very interesting because the Estonian tried to frame this case as a cyber war. And this is important because Estonia is part of NATO. So if it is accepted as an act of war, that the Russia cyber attack is an act of war, it requires that NATO will retaliate against this cyber attack. So it is very interesting. The discourse of this struggle is very interesting because if it's successfully framed as a war, it has a lot of implication for the region security. And then after I'll discuss these kind of issues, which demonstrate. I think it demonstrates nicely what constructivism is, or of course what is securitization process. I'll move to say a few words about constructivism. I didn't forget that I didn't complete last week. There is some comparison I want to make between AI regimes and the NPT regime. I'll get back to it in one of the next classes when I have more time. I'll upload it to the Moodle in the future, and I'll promise to get back to it. I'm also not sure whether I'll be able to cover all of the constructivism today, but we'll continue it next class. I want to remind you that next week we don't have a class because of Passover, and also not in 2 weeks. So next time we'll meet is 3 weeks from now, because it's according to the regular schedule the original schedule of the university, that Passover is at least on Tuesdays. It's two classes that will meet. So let's start with constructivism and the background of constructivism. So securitization, or the Copenhagen school in which it was developed, and actually today, Ole Weaver, one of the founders of this approach, is celebrating 25 years of this theory in a conference. It is considered to be one of the key concepts of theory that the constructivist approach has successfully developed since its emergence in the late 80s. It should, for example, be noted that the book of Buzan Weaver and the Vilda came out in 1998, gained more than 60,000 citations in Google Scholar. It is more, for example, than what Mearsheimer had in his book, although his book is from 2001, but it's considered to be one of the important books in international relation theory. So this is comparable in the amount of attention it has received to Mearsheimer's book. So it's a very prominent area of research. And it is also interesting to know that if we look at the interpretive research on cyber, how scholars use interpretive approaches like constructivism or more critical theories, securitization is one of the key concepts that is applied to study cybersecurity. So there are relatively many researchers on the securitization of the cyber, the securitization of the cyber infrastructure, the securitization of this discourse, as I explained later on regarding the war in Estonia, but there are many other studies. Scholars started to use securitization and cyber as early as the early 2000s. There is a very important work of Ericsson and Giacomello, which I assign you in the first class a paper of them. Another paper, another article they wrote is about the securitization of the cyber, and was one of the first articles to do so. And also there are the work of Miriam Domkevli from ETH Zurich, who used this concept to study the US cyber strategy as it started to be formed in the late 90s and early 2000s. And the last point here is that relatively it is quite intuitive. In terms of constructivism and the constructivist approach, the securitization is quite an intuitive, not always clearly understood, but it is very intuitive in the sense that it is about the discourse of security, and how sometimes it is exaggerated and sometimes it is used to attain legitimacy for policy. So it is also interesting the process through which this theory has been developed, and it has much to do with the end of the Cold War, which to some extent challenged the existing paradigms in international relations, mainly the neoliberal and neorealist approaches, because they very poorly could account for the collapse of the Soviet Union. They very poorly could account for what happened in the superpowers of the Cold War, and therefore there was some interest in other approaches that could provide explanation to what happened, or to different research agendas and to do different things. So the approach started to put emphasis, the constructivist approach started to put emphasis on the social aspects of international relations. And the understanding was that the social aspect, for example, of what is happening in the Soviet Union in terms of the society is important. But also other elements that were brought from sociology into the research of international relations, such as identity, such as social construction, such as norms, and so on, were brought into the research of international relations. And we see it very prominently in the study of the European Union. The emergence, on the one hand, we have the collapse of the Cold War and the collapse, of course, of the Soviet Union, which has much to do with sociology, with the social processes within the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc in general. But we also see the emergence of the European Union, and the European Union is about identity. It's about social processes which create this community. So both elements, on the one hand, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, and on the other hand, the emergence of the European Union or the European community at that time, strengthened the constructivist research in international relations. And one of the phenomena that became very prominent at that time was the change in the political discourse about security. Because once the Cold War ended, policymakers and politicians and practitioners started to shift and change the way they talked about security. Security of the Cold War and security of the post-Cold War in the early 90s were completely different. During the Cold War, the security was the security of states or the superpower, the fear of nuclear war or things that we see in recent days in Israel here, like missile attack and things like that. Well, this was part of the discourse of the fears during the Cold War. Of course, in a greater magnitude of nuclear exchange of missiles and so on. But after the end of the Cold War, the discourse shifted from traditional security issues to new security issues, such as migration, such as pandemics, such as environment. And policymakers and practitioners started to talk about these issues as security issues. And this was an important shift in practice. But also, we noticed that there was a shift in the academic discourse or the academic way of studying security. And there started a debate between those who suggested to continue study traditional security, traditional concept of security of states. The state is the key actor in international security, and the threats are the threats to the state, threat to sovereignty or the ability of the state to survive, and of course the challenges are military capabilities of other states. This is the traditional view of security. But there was also scholars who suggested to extend and broaden the concept of security. And the idea was that not only states are actors who, or which the security should be examined, but also that different kind of threats can be seen as issues of security. So there was a debate between those who suggested to extend or expand the concept of security and those who suggested to limit it to the traditional views of security. So, for example, the traditional approaches suggested that military capabilities of states is the source or the sources of insecurity. And of course, the way to address these challenges is to develop military capabilities to deter or to defend against these kind of challenges. So this is the traditional view of security. But at that time, also started to develop the idea of, for example, human security. And human security was developed in a number of documents, including in Clinton administration, but also in the UN in the early 90s. And they started to focus on people's security, or people insecurity. And if we think what may lead people to be insecure is, of course, completely different issues than those related to state security. And in fact, the state itself can be a source of insecurity for individuals, for people, at least in some states. So, of course, a war can be a source of insecurity for individuals, but also other kind of threats, such as environment, such as crime, pandemic, pollution, and so on. And of course, the ways to address these kind of challenges are completely different than the ways to address the challenges to the state. So sometimes we need to make reforms in the state in order to secure people. Sometimes we need maybe intervention. And here also, at that time, the concept of R2P, which I think I mentioned earlier in the class, has started to emerge. R2P is the responsibility to protect. This is a different doctrine for intervention, because the traditional intervention, according to the UN Charter, is when a state asks for help. When a state asks for help, another state can enter and assist it. According to the human security perspective, it is about individuals, and sometimes the state is the source of insecurity. Therefore, other actors have the responsibility to protect people. So the doctrine or the security is of the people and not of the state. So this is the key element. But again, there was a tension and debate among scholars whether we should extend or not the concept of security. One of the camps, of course, was of the traditional security scholar, the neo-realists, who suggested to keep it limited. Security is only the security of the state. However, others suggested some solution. Benny Miller from Haifa University, for example, suggested a kind of a compromise. Security can be anything that would lead to war. So we keep, in this sense, we keep the traditional view of security as something that is related to war, as neo-realist scholars are interested. But what can lead to war can be anything. So, for example, migration can be a source of war, because this is not a rare occasion that when there is a migration from one country to another, the hosting country that receives immigrations initiate the war in order to stop the flow of people into their territory. So, and we have a number of cases like that. Like, for example, the war of India with Pakistan, and in the context of the Bangladesh establishment in the early 1970s. So there are different kinds of cases in which states are going to war to prevent immigration, but also a shortage of water or other sources may also lead to war. So it's not impossible to think of non-traditional issues that are leading to war. In this way, we can extend the concept of security to different element that would bring to war, but still the war is the key element, the key constitutive element of international security. Of course, this compromise was attacked by both sides. So neo-realist scholars didn't like it because they wanted to limit the scope of security to military capabilities of other actors, while the more recent approaches that started to talk about human security and the constructivist research that started at that time didn't want to limit it to only war, because this is the way neo-realists think about security, and they wanted to extend the concept of security and boundary to acknowledge the security of different kinds of actors. And here comes
how did the war between India and Pakistan was supposed to solve the immigration?
The war, there was a flow of immigrants that coming from Bangladesh. It was originally there was East Pakistan and West Pakistan, and East Pakistan was the area. It became Bangladesh after this war. So it became independent, and the reason that India wanted to, one of the reasons, it was that because of the very poor conditions in Bangladesh at that time, East Pakistan, they were moving into very poor people who were entering India. So they wanted to stop this flow of migration. So they invaded East Pakistan.
So the idea was to invade so they can.
They stopped the migration. They didn't want immigrants from Bangladesh into the territory of India.
I have a question. It's a bit strange for me that this is happened only in 2000, but it sounds to me that most of the wars, at least that I know in the past 100 years, started not just because balance of power. There was something environmental, immigration. You wanted additional land to get resources, to get whatever.
Yeah.
So how come that this is not part of, like, people like the realist approach believe?
This is a good question. To some extent, this is what happens when we think in terms of neo-realism. I mean, it's not a classical realism, but a neo-realism which overemphasize maybe the balance of power and actors or power measured by the military capability or economic capability of the actors, and withdraw from it various assumptions about how actors behave. To some extent, they can take into account these elements because, for example, Mearsheimer talks about resources resources as a component of capability or military capability. You invade the territory in order to get some natural resources that will help you to better fight. But this is not exactly the case here, because shortage of food or water can be understood as something that doesn't necessarily relate to state power, but rather to human catastrophes. And states may go to war for addressing this kind of challenge. Again, it will be out of the scope of neorealism, and this is the limitation of neorealism in this sense. But I think the point is that great powers, which is maybe one of the key elements of neorealism, great powers are not going to war because of these issues. Right? They maybe go to war for a resource like oil, okay, because it enhances their ability to fight. It's a key component of their capabilities and their power as great powers. But they are not interested necessarily in what, it's not important, but the theory itself doesn't give much attention to human security. But what scholars who suggest to extend its suggestion to some extent, and Miller as well, is that it may lead to war, because if a country cannot feed its population, there is a pressure from beneath, or there are. This is another example that was mentioned in the early 2000s. For example, the HIV, which affected in some African states the military, because the population that were in some countries more affected by this virus were people in more urban areas, and they were, so compared to people in the more rural areas, they were more affected, and it also affected the military. So the military was less prepared for war because they are more affected by the virus. So there are some studies about this, for example. This, of course, relates directly to traditional security, but also a kind of a thing that usually neorealists do not think as viruses as a component of security, which I think to some extent also the coronavirus perspective also changed some of the belief of people about what we need to take into account when we think about actors' power capabilities. But you're right to mention it, because I agree with it. This should be more fundamental part of international security.
There is a famous sentence, I think, Stanley Kissinger, which probably was now realist. He said that Israel do not have a foreign policy, it's have only local policy. Domestic policy. So is it like, so we do say that there are things in Israel that cause Israel to change its foreign domestic.
Yes, this is the challenge to neorealism, because neorealism is focused on the capabilities of other actors.
But this sentence was in the 70s.
Yes, of course, but I mean, this is a kind of what a criticism about Israel, that it's not acting according to the neorealism or the realist school.
Yeah, okay. So I understand correct. This is like kind of coming from a realist person.
Yes, of course.
What should guide not doing what he wanted to do?
What should guide actors' policy is the balance of power rather than domestic politics. But we know also Mearsheimer was also obsessed with the Israeli lobby, and this is domestic politics, right? It is not about the balance of power, and to some extent I understand his motivation, because he and also Walt suggested that it's distract the U.S. foreign policy from what it should do, because it shouldn't be about domestic politics, but rather about the balance of power. And balance of power is about China and not Iraq. But again, this is exactly the reason why we need to open the black boxes that neorealists are trying to close. So Miller was one solution, but the Copenhagen school provided different solution to this challenge. According to the Copenhagen School, security is anything, or insecurity is anything that is accepted as security. So when an audience, and the audience can be, for example, the domestic population in a country, when the audience accepts that something is an issue of security, it becomes an issue of security. Okay, this is the idea. That is the social construction. Sorry. When enunciators are able to construct an issue as an existential threat, it becomes an existential threat. Why? Because when they can do it, they allow or legitimize the mobilization of extraordinary measures to address the challenge, whether this is objectively true or not. I mean, the theory, and this is a key element of the theory, is not an objective theory. The question is not whether this is really a threat or not. Okay, this is what neorealists, for example, or other approaches are studying when they are studying security, whether there is a real threat or not. For example, when an opponent has a certain amount of tanks or military power, it can be a threat, right? But in order to know this, we need to look into the details and understand what is the power of our opponent. For the Copenhagen School, it is not important. It's not important in general, but it's not important for the theory, because the theory does not have tools to study whether something is real threat or not. What they are focusing is how an issue becomes an existential threat, how it is constructed as an existential threat, and therefore it provided very powerful lenses to study the emerging discourse of security in Europe. Because in Europe, in the early 90s, scholars are starting to talk about immigration as an existential threat. Objectively, it's not necessarily a threat, or objectively, it's not a threat at all at that time. But they are framing it as an existential threat, and therefore try to mobilize extraordinary measures to address these threats, despite they are not real. Or we can also think of other kinds of threat. It is, of course, possible to securitize a real threat. Okay, it is possible to securitize a real threat. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a threat to securitize it. In some cases, I mean, it might sometimes even more easy to securitize a real threat. I mean, the question is not whether we cannot determine whether it is a real threat or not by the fact that it has been securitized. We just follow the process through something is becoming in the discourse an existential threat and is accepted by the audience as an existential threat. And once this happens, we see it as a process or a dynamic of securitization. As such, it allows, of course, to capture both traditional and non-traditional security issues. For most of the scholars who study securitization, the interest was to study non-traditional security issues, right? Because it seemed at that time quite obvious to argue that nuclear weapons is an issue of security. And of course, it's an issue of security. This is kind of the traditional discourse of security, insecurity. They were interested at that time in the 90s, in the early 2000s, in showing how non-traditional issues become security issues, as migration, pandemics, our environment is existential threat, because this was completely different from the traditional security discourse that preceded. So I have, for example, one article I published a few years ago about the limited research of securitization in Israel. Because you would expect that Israel, with all the hyper securitization discourse, will be a kind of an actor that usually often is being subjected to research using the concept of securitization, the theory of securitization, but it was very rare. There were very few studies until a decade ago about securitization processes in Israel. And one of the reasons is that scholars of securitization were interested in non-traditional security issues, and in Israel, the traditional security discourse is very prominent. Therefore, it is was not very appealing for the research for scholars who wanted to show how security goes beyond the traditional security issues. There was also another problem, which is that by definition, Israel is in a state of emergency. And all the process of securitization is to bring something from the normal politics into the politics of emergency. So how you can deal with a country that already is in a state of emergency and is already in a state of securitization. So what it requires, I think, and to some extent the research of securitization has started to address this gap, is to look at different levels or different way of securitization. Not all the securitization moves are similar, and by further developing the theory of securitization, it became easier to account for these kinds of dynamics. So, of course, for traditional security scholars, the solution offered by the Copenhagen School was not very attractive because they are interested, traditional security scholars are interested in traditional security concept, and it is an objective approach about security. So they are not interested in the discourse of security. For example, Mershomer doesn't care about whether we call it an existential threat or just a threat. It doesn't really matter for him or for other realist scholars. They don't really care about the discourse of security. They care much about facts or numbers or elements that can be used to judge or determine the security or insecurity of the actors. For example, whether the opponent has a military capability or enormous amount of military capability, then we treat it as a threat. But we don't need this. So they were, of course, not persuaded by this approach. So let's look a bit more deeply into this approach. So there are a number of components of securitization. One was it puts much emphasis on the social construction of security. Security, again, is not an objective situation or not an objective state, but rather it is a social construction, which means that it is a process that is shaped by discourse. And then, when something is constructed as an existential threat, if the audience accepts that it's an existential threat, it legitimizes taking extraordinary measures, exceptional measures to address the threat. And this is why it is important, because once an audience accepts that something is an existential threat, it changes the politics. It becomes normal part of the normal politics, but the politics of emergency. And this is important for the Copenhagen School because they warn against this kind of dynamics. They want things to remain in the normal politics not move into the state of emergency. In addition, we can talk about a number of in addition, there are other elements. One is the securitizing actor, which is the enunciator, who construct the insecurity. So usually they can be policymakers, states leaders, and so on, but not necessarily. So it's like the theory doesn't limit in any way who could be an enunciator. But the enunciator also should be studied along with the audience. So there's an audience to whom the enunciator speaks to. And once the audience accepts the securitizing move, the existential threat, there is a successful securitization move. In addition, Huzan and Weaver and Fielder talk about 5 sectors of security, and each sector has its unique elements of security. What can be framed or constructed as an issue of security differs in each of these sectors. This is important, by the way, for our discussion later on about cyber. For example, think where cyber enters this kind of sector, to which sector cybersecurity is related. So one sector is the military. So we can, of course, talk about traditional security issues. We can talk about economic security. We can talk about political security. We have the societal security, which is about identity. So the identity can be under a threat, under an existential threat. And we also have the environment. So for each sector, there is a different securitizing plot. There are different kind of stories that can be told about security, or more precisely about insecurity. And in addition, and this is the constructive element of securitization. Securitization is, according to the Copenhagen School, is a speech act. A speech act is an act that is constituted by language. For example, I apologize, right? When I'm saying I'm apologizing, I'm constituting the act of apology. I cannot apologize without saying I'm apologize. Right? I can do some gestures, but it would not be the same. I can bring flowers, okay? But it wouldn't be the same as if I say it. So in a wedding, when the priest says, I announce you as a husband and wife, it constituted the act by the priest saying these words. So these kinds of acts are speech act in the sense that they are constituted by the language. And the Copenhagen School suggests that this is the same about security. When an enunciator says that something is an issue of security, it is speech act. It becomes an issue of security.
So if, for example, there is missiles, okay, only after someone either admits or takes responsibility that they initiated that, then it becomes an issue of security.
There are a number of ways to. Of course, traditional security scholars don't care about what we say. This is this is threat for constructive scholars, and this is, we can take it in. Of course, after they were launched, they are, of course, but think of situations that they were not launched yet. And United States, for example, has many missiles. Okay, so there are politicians in other countries that, like in Iran, that would say this is an existential threat for us, right? We need to take extraordinary measures to prevent this threat. But this is not necessarily happening in all the states, right? In Israel, we are not securitizing the United States, the American missiles, or in Canada, they are not securitizing the missiles. But I mean, we can imagine a scenario in which there is a politician in Canada, like I don't know, like populist Canadian, I don't know, something like that. But for the example, who's trying to say, United States has too many missiles. It's an existential threat for us. We need to do something about it, right? So this would be a securitizing. The question is whether there is an audience to this kind of.
And if there is no audience for that, then.
So this is a failed securitizing attack. And here this is a very delicate issue because there is a great tension here between what I mentioned earlier about what is securitization success and the Speech Act. And a few scholars are pointed to this issue because on the one hand, I said that securitization is successful when the audience accepts it as an existential threat, right? This is one element. But then I said that it's constituted by the Speech Act and there is no agency for the audience because it becomes a securitization by the Speech Act. There's no agency for the audience to accept or not accept it. So it is a tension there, and some scholars are more attentive to it and some are less attentive to it. And this also brought to the emergence of what is called the price school, which is a social a la Bourdieu conceptualization of securitization. And they are much more attentive to the different elements that account for securitization success, like more in a positivist research that what factors would likely bring to securitization success. When the enunciator is more likely to succeed in persuading the audience that we should take these kind of extraordinary measures. But the Copenhagen School itself is in a kind of a clash between these two elements, because if we are saying that the Speech Act is constituted in the act of securitization, we don't need the audience, and if we are arguing that the audience accepts or cannot accept or not likely to accept something as an existential threat or the securitizing move, we don't allow for the Speech Act of security. So there is a tension. Yes.
Isn't it like in language, you can say I apologize and it's an apology, but whether the other side decides that it's a real apology, it's for them to decide.
Yes, it's true. Yes, of course. This is a good point.
Really important.
But this is not exactly what the Copenhagen School suggests. They suggest that it is very powerful. I mean, there can be the solution to the problem, but then we need to give agency to the audience. And with the more agency we give to the audience, we take a step back or limit the power of the Speech Act. As you mentioned, if it's for the audience to determine whether it is a sincere act of securitization or a sincere act of apology, then we give much agency to the audience, and it's not kind of a deterministic process initiated by the Speech.
It is.
It is not exactly clear, and some of the solution are going to your suggestion that we can think of it as a Speech Act, but it also requires the approval of the audience, that this is the sincerity of the act, or whether they think this is sincerity is not necessarily the right. I mean, it's with apology. But there is a lot of in language studies. There's a lot of discussion about the sincerity of the enunciator in the Speech Act, whether it is sincere or not, and this accounts for or part of the process of making a speech. Or the assumption is that there is a sincerity of the speaker. Of course, as we know in the context of security, in many cases, the enunciators are not sincere in the sense that they don't necessarily believe that this is an existential threat, and despite this fact, they are securitizing it in order to achieve some other political goals.
The question is whether the audience believes them or not. Like,
Yes.
it's not whether.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's in many cases the audience believe that this is it's a sincere, therefore they accept it, or they, given their identity and social norms and social context, they are willing to accept this movement. This is exactly what the Paris School does. It takes on the one hand the speech act of security, but also takes into account the social context within which it happened. The identity of the speaker and the audience, the norms of the society, and so on, and try to explain why and how the securitizing process is successful.
It's for the Copenhagen, it's just said it and that's the.
Yes, but on the other hand, as I mentioned, they also suggest that it is securitization success is determined by the audience acceptance. So they didn't in the 1998 book, they didn't fully solve this tension, because if we say that it's the audience to decide, then it's the audience to decide, which brings into attention, as you suggested, the sincerity of the speaker or the belief of the audience of the sincerity of the speaker. But there's no such kind of discussion to this level in this book. So it remained unsolved, and it attracted much attention from scholars who criticized this approach for not being attentive to the tension between the speech act and the audience acceptance.
And the identity of the speaker.
Sorry?
They address the identity of the speaker.
In the book, you mean? Not really. They as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the sectors. So identity is mentioned in the book as one of the sectors in which there are plots of insecurity.
No, I mean like if Greg Professor says something.
No, because they were not in. I'll talk about it later on, but I'll say briefly that they are not interested in kind of a positivistic account of what are the factors that lead to the securitization success.
Yeah, but I think there's a difference if the Prime Minister says something and I say.
Of course. I totally agree. So this would be like X causing Y. So X and B, for example, the position of the speaker, right? So there are speakers that could more easily speak security than others. But it is a slippery slope for the Copenhagen School, because then it's like a positivist approach that says under what conditions securitization succeed or fail. And they didn't want to enter this kind of situation because it would make it a positivist approach, and they don't do it. So there is a debate in securitization studies about what is legitimate causal connection. So for Weaver, for example, securitization can be a dependent variable. So once we have securitization, it can cause something, but they don't. This is something they don't do. They don't study. The Copenhagen School doesn't study how something makes securitization success. For them, this is okay to study. So once we have securitization, it has some effect or implication on the politics, on politics of the state, on politics of other states, and so on. And this is a legitimate kind of area for research, but this is not. This is not. But there are scholars would do this kind of connection, as you mentioned. For example, the position of the speaker as an element. And so Thierry Balzac, for example, is working on these kind of areas.
Can we say that there is a race for privatization? So
There is
a race. Everyone want to securitize any single problem. And politicians, because of their own purposes, they want our vote, so they secure or other actors, like what in the environmental stuff.
you can. I mean, this is a cynical.
Books and papers try.
This is a cynical view of politics, but in many ways, this is politics who gain to securitize what they want to securitize. So if they are able to pursue the audience that their view of what is security or insecurity is the way to look at security, they can mobilize support because of the power of the discourse of security. This is why securitization is so powerful, because the politics of fear is very powerful politics. And this many politicians, especially in the last decades, are using to mobilize support. So it's more easy to mobilize support by the fear of an existential threat and define it whatever you want. It's about migration, it's about environment, it's about the identity of an enemy, and so on. If you do that, this is some extent define politics in our way. Yes.
Do we consider this a necessary condition? I mean, does the corollary hold that if something is not enunciated, then it never becomes an existential threat?
This is a philosophical question, I think, because neo-realist scholars would suggest that there are facts. For example, nuclear weapon doesn't need someone to say that this is an existential threat. It's quite obvious that this is an existential threat. But some would argue, some scholars would challenge this argument, say that in many situations, the question of what is an existential threat is not clear. We need, for example, the nuclear weapons of another state. It can be a source of security, but it can be a source of insecurity. It depends from the context on the history of the relations between the sides and so on. There are many aspects to it, but it can be used. It can be actors can take advantage of it, and this is, I think, the more unique or important elements of securitization, because sometimes speakers can take advantage of situations, framing them as existential threat, despite the fact that these are not existential threat or not an existential threat to a specific audience.
But does it imply that we are infinitely secure if we know nothing? We never discuss anything. According to this,
I can tell you what Ola Weaver. I asked him a similar question. I was in one of my sabbatical I spent in Copenhagen, and I asked him about this dynamic, because it is not an objective theory, but sometimes in order to know whether if a securitizing move is justified or not, the question is an objective question. And it remains out of the scope of the theory, because the theory doesn't have tools to study whether it's objectively legitimized or not to securitize a certain issue. And he said that it is correct that in some situation we need to securitize. If we cannot do anything else, and we don't have any option, like there is a concrete threat to launch nuclear missiles against a certain actor, right? He needs to securitize it, of course, because he needs to legitimize measures to counter this kind of attack. So they are willing to accept this kind of challenges, and this implies that they acknowledge that it's the fact that you are not securitizing an issue doesn't mean that you are secure, because you are sometimes insecure, or sometimes may become insecure because you didn't securitize the real threat that you're facing. But the problem is that sometimes, and this is one of the main maybe challenges, that sometimes you securitize the wrong threats and you are not aware or do not put much attention to the real threat because you securitize or obsessed with other kind of challenges that prevent you from addressing the real threat you are facing. So I wouldn't say that the theory or the scholars of securitization are completely ignorant of the real threat. But the question is, who is doing securitization, to what purposes, and whether there are real threats that are ignored or not. But I mean, this is also the limitation of the theory, because they don't have better tools than the other theories to examine whether something is a real threat or not. We need the other theories, we need the other expertise to understand what are the real threats. And this is not necessarily military threats, but also threats of environment, for example, pandemics. We need expertise in these fields to know whether something is a real threat or not. And sometimes the ability to gain knowledge about these challenges is very problematic, because we cannot really know. There's a lot of uncertainties, not only about the capability of another actor, but also about the pandemic. Whether, for example, the corona was an existential threat or not. I mean, we know today much more than we knew at that time, but and you can ask questions about the securitizing move that were taken at that time. So the closing everything, shutting down different countries. This is an extraordinary measure, right?
So the arbitrariness is not complete. I mean, it's not, the claim is not that basically the process of enunciation and the agreement determines whether or not the issue is existential.
Yes.
Or
yes. It's not the real challenge is not determined by the discourse. The discourse try to I mean, this is relate to what we talked earlier about, the sincerity of the speakers. If they are sincere, they may securitize
their accuracy, whether or not.
Yes, I mean sometimes, and I can provide an interesting example in this context. For example, let's assume in Israel there is someone that believes that the Iranian threat is an existential threat to Israel and securitize it. He might be sincere, he doesn't necessarily know whether this is an existential threat or not. Another way to think of it, it is that there is an existential threat. Objectively, there is an existential threat, and an assertor securitizing it or misses it. And there's also a fourth option that an assertor knows that is not a real threat, and despite its fact, securitizing it. So in any of these situations, there can be securitization or mis-securitization or non-securitization.
But what I'm trying to clarify is whether or not securitizing something means changing the way we manage our discourse surrounding it, or change the actual nature of it.
So in many cases, we cannot change the nature of it, but we can be more prepared or take measures to counter this. I mean, this is mainly it depends on the threat. For example, in the environment area, we might take measures that would preempt the catastrophe in a way that prevent it. We change our behavior in a way that there will not be a climate change in the future, because we will not use certain things that pollute the environment and so on. In some cases, we cannot. I mean, it's more challenging. For example, Iran has a nuclear weapons. We can attack Iran, but we can also take other measures like bolster our deterrent posture or build a lot of shelters and so on. So, I mean, what is the extraordinary measures? What are the extraordinary measures? Depends on many elements.
But then what makes it not a tautology? What makes it an added
Yeah.
statement?
No, again, this is exactly why it is, because if we treat it as a positivist approach, it's kind of a tautology, right? Because someone said that it's an existential threat and it becomes an existential threat.
In our discourse.
Yeah.
If we accept it as an existential threat, then we accept it as an existential.
Yeah, so, but the idea of this approach, constructivist approach, is exactly the process of the social construction. So the social construction of an issue as an existential threat is the issue that we need to focus on. And in this way, it differs from what positivist scholar would study. This is exactly, and I'll get back to it later on when I frame it, the Copenhagen school as part of constructivist approach, because to be brief, I mentioned it in the first class. For positivist scholars, this is the X causing Y, right? For constructivist scholars, X is Y in a certain context. So immigrants are constructed as an existential threat in a specific context. It is not a causal connection. That is not that the immigrant is causing insecurity. It's the immigrants are constructed as
society learns or constructs this concept. I mean, it develops to treat this concept as a
yes.
It's like almost borrowing from like Piagetian concepts, right?
It is a
society.
Yes. It's a social construction. This is the idea of social construction, which cannot be studied with positivist tools. This is completely different. And it remains as part of the discourse. So this is part of the criticism of why Mearsheimer doesn't care about the discourse. But it's a completely different kind of research this is an interpretive research rather than positivist research that tries to find causal connections between variables. This is not variables. These are social aspects of society.
But again, it's not as radical as to go ahead and say that something is only dangerous if we recognize it as.
Yeah, no.
It just said that the behavior of entities when it comes to security issues is constructed in this way.
Yes.
It's constructed.
It's constructed, yes, it's not postmodern or this is exactly constructivism, that we look at how the social world is constructed by language. Our language is important in our way, in our life, in international politics. Okay, so I think it's time for having a break. So we'll have 15 minutes break, and after that, I'll complete the discussion of securitization, and we'll move to the cyber. We'll further discuss these issues. Okay, let's continue. So
לא, אבל אם אני מדבר אבל עדיין אני צעיר לחלוטין. השאלה אם השאלה אם מה שמדברים
okay. So let's open the discussion Okay, so let's who wants to be the first? Which group want to start? Okay, you want to start?
Next time I'm sitting there.
You want to start?
Why not Tony? Already, no. Okay.
I know you have good points, so.
We all know. Okay, so we kind of broke it down into like two sections, and then we'll talk about the securitization section afterwards. But the 2 points that we wanted to focus on regarding like the actual discourse of cyber security is that first you have the issue of attribution, what makes it very difficult when it's an attack, essentially. So like with even the 2021 Colonial Pipeline disrupted major gas lines throughout America. To this day, we think it's Eastern European country, but most likely Russia. So there's that issue. The second issue is that we discussed that a cyber attack doesn't necessarily constitute an act of war. So again, with the 2021 Colonial Pipeline, there was an attack, there was a ransomware attack, but the US didn't declare war against Russia in similar cases with like Chinese, Chinese government conducting major attacks against like major companies is still acting. So there's also that issue. And then when it comes to securitization, like the theory itself, like you said, like it doesn't necessarily mean war, but where does cyber play a role? And so we kind of thought that cyber shouldn't be treated as its own separate category, but something that affects environmental, military, economic, and all areas of society. And then we also considered the aspect of okay, maybe technology being a separate sector, but then again, that also has large implications for all areas of society.
So maybe the cyber security emphasizes that all sectors are interconnected in one way or another. So the discourse of security is something that relates to all. I mean, cyber domain are related to all the sectors.
In that way, it's more interdisciplinary. So it kind of goes against that traditional way of thinking, because cyber, I think in itself is very interdisciplinary. And that's kind of what we've been studying this for the past semester too.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
We have discussed that once securitization came in, it's actually opened the door for any problem that exists to become a security problem, and therefore it's also applied for the cyber, which means that if when we spoke about realist approach or superpower or all those discussion, then it was a little bit different, because it's different way of looking to things. Now it's actually one more risk or one more security problem or advantage as education, as health, as any other. And regarding the pillars, we argue a lot about it. I don't think we have a good conclusion. We've started from.
It's also telling that
we started from what Tony just said, that this is actually the base for everything, and it served all the economic and the society and the politics and everything. But in the end of the discussion, we said that it's a very unique characteristic, and therefore it should be considered as additional as the sixth pillar.
Okay. Thank you.
We have the rest.
Yeah.
So first of all, we started the conversation if cyber threat can really be considered an existential threat. And from understanding that maybe it's really not a discussion because it's not objective, right?
Right.
It's how can and then when we looked about the different aspects of politics, economy, so I think we think that
cyber threat is another way to show that it's an existential threat, right? So it's just another, I would say excuse, but another reason to show, oh, this is.
Yeah.
So anything you can say, oh, it could hurt our economy, then it's a threat, and cybersecurity can be a cyber threat. Can be that.
Okay, good, thank you. Anyone want to add something before we? Okay, so let's start with Hansen and with Lisenbaum. And Hansen also Ron Diebert, one of the leading scholars of cybersecurity or cyber and international relations, and we can identify a number of issues and a number of questions. First, who is under the threat, right? This is a key question. Who is threatened? Because it can be the plots of insecurity can be about the national security or the state security, right? This is one way to think of cyber insecurity. The second is private security. So it is possible to securitize individual cyber security, like the privacy of individuals can be securitized in one or another way, but also the network itself can be securitized. The network or other cyber infrastructures can be themselves be securitized. In addition, and this is based on Lisenbaum and Hansen article, they identify three unique or challenges about the securitization of the cyber. One is what they call hyper-securitization, which is the over-securitization of issues and the exaggeration of the threat. So, and this relates to two other characteristics they identify. Another one is I'll get back to that later on. One of that is the technification. Because we don't have knowledge, we need the experts to tell us what is security and insecurity. So for them, I mean, I'm not necessarily saying I agree with this argument, because we can also think of the environment or nuclear technology also need experts to tell us what is a threat or not. So, but they argue that this is a unique dynamic because we need the knowledge, and we don't have as individuals, private individuals, we don't have the knowledge. We need to rely on experts. I'll get back to that later on. But one is the exaggeration of the threat, and this is also affected by the technical knowledge that we don't have. So we need to buy this discourse of insecurity. And there are also some other elements. First, and it's allude to what you also discussed earlier, it's process sectors. Right? It's not only the cyber not affects only one sector, but a number of sectors, sometimes simultaneously, a number of sectors. And we don't have descendant to cyber disasters. We don't have cyber insecurity history as we have in other. So we need to imagine it, and it's something. Sometimes it is more challenging. And we can tell different kinds of, we don't know how bad it can get, so we can think of the worst case scenario, which not necessarily well capture reality. We also, and this is also why discourse and securitization of cyber is very common, because we are relying all the time on analogies, right? We don't have the necessarily the right or the accurate term to speak of cybersecurity, so we borrow the almost every term we use in the cyber domain about security is kind of an analogy, right? The cloud, okay? It's not really cloud, right? Or electronic Pearl Harbor, and there is an entire book published a few years ago about cyber analogies and cybersecurity analogies. So one of them is Pearl Harbor, which is a very prominent analogy, but this is the problem with analogies, but this is not exactly the accurate way to think of cyber threat. So when we use analogies, or even virus, it's not really virus, right? We use these terms in order to better understand what we cannot imagine. So we use these analogies, but it's also divert. So on the one hand, it's part of the securitization because it's a virus. We need to take measures to prevent viruses, to prevent or preempt electronic Pearl Harbor. But on the other hand, it is not the very accurate way to think of these kind of situations. And in addition to what was said in the first group, and you're completely right about the attribution, but it's even more fundamental. It's not only the attribution, but the identification of the challenge in the first place. So not only we don't know who did it, we not necessarily know that something happened. And this, of course, provides or creates another challenge or other challenges. Because cyber threats cannot easily be observed, and of course, the audience definitely doesn't see it, right? The public doesn't see the cyber attack. We at some cases we can see or observe the consequences. So if there is a kind of catastrophe that is caused by the invasion to a computer, then we see the outcomes that resulted from this cyber attack. But if this is just a cyber attack and a sabotage in a computer, we don't see anything as the public. But in other cases we can see it, not necessarily in all cases. In the environment, we also don't necessarily see the climate change. We feel it, but we need a period of time to understand that something is going on. So it's not, we can talk how the weather is warming, but there are also days that are not very warm, right? So, it's required collection of data, and in this sense, it's not only the cyber that is not easily observed. But we don't see it. Unlike, for example, a military attack on a state, we have photos of this attack. Right? We see how they are pulling the missile from the Dead Sea. If you saw this picture, we see the threat. We see it's visualized. The cyber attack are not really visualized. We have constructional visualization of the threat. And by the way, one of the directions of securitization scholarship in general is about visual securitization. It's not only verbal securitization, but with photo, with images, you can also securitize different kind of things, and also relate to the difficulties of securitization or challenges, or the ways in which cyber security is securitized. So these challenges create ambiguity regarding cyber security or insecurity. To some extent, and this is my maybe argument in this regard, is the popular culture has much to do about how we imagine cybersecurity and insecurity, because we don't see cybersecurity. We can think of cybersecurity through what we learn through Hollywood or other TV shows, and I'll show you not next class, but I think in one after, about when we talk about ontological security. I'll show you parts of very short part of James Bond Skyfall. I think it's clearly demonstrates some of the elements, but also it's not exactly how cyber attacks are created, but it's a way to visualize, but it's also securitize to some extent the threat, because this is how we think of the threat, or hackers with with walking in dark rooms with hoods on their head, and these are, I mean, they don't necessarily need to be this kind of people, but we learn from the media and the popular culture what we expect about these challenges. And also, as I mentioned earlier, these ambiguities, these children, we don't see it. We need to rely on experts. We need to rely on experts and what they tell us about insecurity. Again, this is true, but I'm not sure this is a unique element of cyber insecurity, because in other realm we also need to rely on insecurity. I don't know. I mean, as an individual about climate, right? I need to learn from experts who tell me that if we collect data for a long period of time, we see that there are significant changes from what happened. I mean, I can feel maybe that it's warmer, but it's not the same as someone telling me that if we collect data for 50 years, we see that there is global warming. And the same regarding the implication of how do I know what are the implications of nuclear attack? I mean, I don't know. And one could also argue that, especially what the Iranian, for example, have, even the former head of the Mossad, Amir Pardo, said that Iranian nuclear weapons is not an existential threat to Israel, because Israel has measures to address it and prevent it. And in anyhow, they don't have the hydrogen bomb. They have a less sophisticated nuclear or atom warheads. So again, this is an example how experts are important not only in the field of cybersecurity, but in other fields as well, unlike what Hansen and Nissenbaum are. Second characteristic, or different characteristic of cybersecurity discourse, that it relates to daily practices. And it relates to behavior of people or individual experiences. Part of this securitization relates to the way people should behave, or what challenge they are facing in their everyday practices, which is different from other securitization, for example, nuclear weapons as a threat. But on the other hand, climate change, it also alludes to how individuals should behave and how we can. I mean, to some extent, some argue that it's not really matter what we do in our daily life, because the main causes of global warming is the oil companies and the big industries that pollute the environment, and the difference we as individuals can make is very small. But anyhow, it is again relates to expert knowledge. And again, this is the signification, which, as I mentioned earlier, is the reliance on experts. And there are some implications for the reliance on experts, because they are perceived to be objective, right? They are impartial. They have no interest. It's just the knowledge that speaks. While other fields or other sectors are considered to be political, of course, the political sector, but also the military, the environment are considered to be very political sectors, while the cyber is kind of a very natural, objective field based on the knowledge and expertise of people who know the field. Okay, so this, for example, I mentioned it in one of the group, some examples of securitization of cyberspace. And this is a report issued by the Department of Defense in 2017, and they securitized cyber attacks to justify exceptional measures, including nuclear retaliation. So in this report, in this document, they refer, yes.
About technical.
Yeah.
Isn't it the same with weapons?
Nuclear weapons, you said?
You need
Yes,
to be an expert.
yes. This is something I also mentioned earlier, that when you have, I mean, I don't agree with Lena Hansen and Nissenbaum in the sense that there are other fields that require expertise, like the environment, which is also a field that we need knowledge of experts, because otherwise I wouldn't know that there is
And
climate
you need an
change.
expert.
And also in the nuclear, there are experts who can tell me what would be the damage that a nuclear attack would cause, whether this is an existential threat or not. Because maybe we have the measures to address this, to preempt it, or, I mean, we need experts. But I think that, and this is something that maybe was more accurate like a decade ago, 15 years ago, when we wrote this paper, that the cyber field, the cyber sector, was seen to be more objective, not political, as the other fields. And this is the typification of the field, that we rely on like an objective knowledge, while the other sectors, like the military, is more political oriented than this.
Definitely not true anymore.
Yeah, I'm not sure it was ever true, but this was, I think more people were not aware to the fact that this is political in even 15 years ago. So in this document, you see they use existential cyber attack. I mean, they use the exact words, and this is also something that we can see or analyze when we examine text, that sometimes we need to infer the existentiality of the situation, but sometimes, and in fact, in quite many occasions, we have these exact words that they talk about an existential threat, right? This appears, and in this sense, they refer in this document to a situation in which there is a cyber attack that would prevent United States from nuclear retaliation. So this can accumulate into an existential cyber attack that may justify a nuclear retaliation in order to prevent such an attack or the threat. I mean, the idea is to issue a nuclear retaliation as a threat to prevent such an attempt to affect its ability to use its nuclear capabilities. The key example that Nissenbaum and Hansen use in their paper, and this is actually a very interesting case in general, regardless of cyber, but there is a statue. This is a memorial for the Soviet soldiers of the Second World War. But in Estonia, they're also the occupiers of Estonia. So, I mean, there's a lot of baggage into the Soviet memorials in the center of Tallinn. So, what they did is to remove, the Estonian government decided in 2007 to remove this statue from center of Estonia to a different place, much
Far from Tallinn.
yes. So I don't know exactly, but I told someone who said that he was there, and I mean, it's a shabby area to which this statue was moved. So there's some kind of maybe humiliation associated with that. But the point is that in Estonia there is a Russian minority, and they didn't like the decision, and there was some clashes in which I mean, there's the big minority of Russian, a quarter of the population in Estonia are Russian, and there were clashes. One was killed, and more than 1,000 were injured in these clashes. And it, of course, brought the attention of Russia to this event. And the response was a cyber attack targeting banks in Estonia and some governmental websites, including the parliament. So this was a kind of a simple attack. It is a DOS attack, denial of service attack, which you send a lot of information in short time, and it creates overload in the servers. They could not handle this information, and therefore they collapsed. And the damage was, I mean, there was a damage. Estonia is advanced cyber country. They are heavily relying on cyber technology, even in the early or the mid 2000s, and it causes the inability of people to use these services for a few days. This was about it. So it isn't. Nobody was killed because of that. Nobody lost money. The banks were not accessible through the website, and Parliament website didn't work for a few days. But the Estonian government, the defense minister of Estonia, termed it as a national security situation, and they tried to frame it as the first cyber war. And this has significant implications because Estonia is part of NATO. If NATO sees that the attack as an act of war, it requires NATO to retaliate. And NATO to present their stance on it, didn't want to retaliate, didn't want to escalate the situation with Russia, especially not given the fact that the damage was very limited, right? They didn't want to escalate it. So NATO, while the New York Times bought this framing of the first cyber war, and it was published there, it was not accepted in this way in NATO, and there are a number of reasons for that. One is, of course, the reluctance of NATO to retaliate and escalate the situation with Russia. And second, which is also interesting, they could not, or they were limited in their ability to attribute the attack to Russia. So they knew that there are some Russian-affiliated Russian groups, but the question is whether there was an order from Moscow to initiate this attack, or there was some groups that identified with Russia and initiated this attack. Again, this question, this is kind of objective issue, right? It's not whether it's not about the discourse, but rather objective reality is whether it is possible to identify the attackers, to attribute them, and the fear of Russian retaliation, which is kind of a deterrent effect of Russia, both outside the scope of the Copenhagen School. So this is the situation regarding the attempt to securitize it, and also exemplifies that different audiences may accept or not accept the suggested framing. So the New York Times, for example, accepted this framing, but not NATO, which was maybe the main target of the securitizing move because they wanted NATO helping them. So this is I'll talk at the beginning of next week about constructivism. So we'll meet again on May 7th. Next week, this is the Passover recess, and we'll discuss international norms. To some extent, it continues the discussion we had about international regimes, because international regimes, as we discussed, are relying usually on norms, right? There is a norm, a key norm that constitutes the regime, or the regime is built around a certain norm. But the way we talked about regimes was more like in the context of neoliberalism. And I want to talk about international norms in the context of constructivism. So we'll connect this discussion. And there are two main articles. One is the seminal work on international norms written by Marta Finamo and Katerina Thicking. This is one of the key constructivist articles from the late 90s. And the second is another paper of Marta Finamo criticizing the way, with a co-author, criticizing the way in which international norms are used as a concept in the study of cyber norms. And one of the arguments they make in this paper is that they think of international norm in the context of cyber as neoliberal scholars refer to norm and not as constructivist scholars study norms. And this is a point we'll further discuss in the class. So I'll make the review of constructivism, and then I'll move to international. So goodbye, and I hope you enjoy the recess as possible, and that will be no war in between. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye bye.
So-
Right.